Our next talk is titled "Technological Disruption of the Media and the Rise of the Fake News," Rise of Fake News. And our speaker is Jeffrey Herbst, who is the president and CEO of the Newseum. Prior to that, was president of Colgate University. Also is a political scientist. So has lots of different views on this. And he'll speak, and after that, David McCabe, who's a journalist from Axios, and covers the, I think he's called it the collision of tech policy and something else. Collision, okay, right. And he'll sort of then moderate a discussion and then turn to the audience. So, Jeff, please.
Thanks so much and good morning. As you just heard, I'm president and CEO of the Newseum. Our building on Pennsylvania Avenue welcomes about 800,000 visitors a year to 15 exhibits that talk about the evolution of the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. And we reach about 8 million school children in 159 countries through digital outreach, also releasing lesson plans about the 5 freedoms: speech, press, religion, petition, and assembly. I want to talk about fake news today, topic much in the news, but I don't want to lose sight of the bigger context, which is we have witnessed over the last 20 years or so the greatest explosion in free expression in human history. I'm not going to talk about that at all, but that's the context. And given the extraordinary evolution, just in this country alone, we've gone in the news from a system where 2 newspapers and 3 television networks served as the gatekeepers for almost all information, to a world where 17-year-olds can have an audience of 10 million on YouTube for free. That's an extraordinary development, and in many ways the First Amendment realized. Not surprisingly, in that kind of revolution, there are going to be downsides. And one of them is fake news, or the deliberate spread of misinformation, which of course has been going on for some time, but reached public notice during the campaign and afterwards, when people realized that the Pope did not endorse Donald Trump and that there were a couple hundred Macedonian teenagers pumping out a lot of fake news and some other things which you're well aware of. Let me give you what I think is the bottom line, and then I'll go back and tell you how I got there. First, I think the problem is going to become much worse before it gets better. Second, there are probably not, in the main, going to be a technological solution to the problems of people who want to pollute our information ecosystem. And third, we're going to have to emphasize the education of the American consumer and consumers worldwide about how to differentiate between quality and fake news, and that's probably the long-term solution. Now, to define my terms, I'm not talking about poor journalism. Journalists make mistakes, and it's often hard to cover news stories. All of you have expert knowledge, and you probably know that the more expertise you have in an area, the less likely you find the stories that you read about your subject matter to be particularly persuasive. I think we've all had that experience. That's not fake news. That's the difficulties of journalism and, to some extent, poor journalism. Fake news is something that's deliberately false and, within the current context, designed to be spread, especially by social media platforms, for economic or for political gain. So there's a deliberate element of malfeasance in it, as opposed to just making mistakes. At the Newseum, we always like to put things in historical context, and I should note, therefore, that there's always been fake news. In the 1890s, of course, in this country, we saw what became known as yellow journalism, which may have led to the United States entering what became the Spanish-American War, and may very well have led to the assassination of President McKinley in 1901. So there's always been that element of people trying to leverage news for their own advantage. Current situation bears some similarities to the past, but also, of course, some real differences, especially in how quickly news can ricochet around the world. Now, what's caused this problem? Why are we facing such an issue that many people find the sheer credibility of news in our information ecosystem to be challenged? And do we face the problem of our information as it courses through the world becoming less and less credible, so that at the end of the day, we may have connected everyone, but no one believes what they're reading unless it's shared by someone else? A couple of different long-term structural causes have made this situation what it is. It didn't just come about during the campaign. First is the long-term decline in America's trust of the media. This has been going on for 20 or 25 years. It's not unique to the media. In fact, Americans' trust of all institutions, except for the military, has been declining for over 20 years. And we face a society which just doesn't believe, especially doesn't believe in top-down information like it used to. So that's the first general cause. Second situation, which you well know, has been the destruction of the financial model around traditional journalism. Now, news has often been a bad business. Benjamin Franklin established the post office in part to subsidize newspapers because even then they were having trouble. But we all know that traditional journalism, dare I say, legacy journalism, is in deep trouble. Circulation of major newspapers has been declining for many years. The number of people who are working as journalists has declined significantly. And critically, ad revenue, which used to be one of the mainstays of the financial model, is just evaporating. As news goes more and more mobile, most of the ad revenue is being captured not by the news producers, but by the social media companies, especially Google and Facebook, which are able to grab a lot of the advertising revenue. And this has caused, as we've seen, a real cratering of the traditional news model and of traditional news properties. It's going to get worse. In the next 10 years, we're probably going to see especially visible challenges to major American metropolitan dailies outside of New York and Washington, who face the problem that they don't have an audience that is national enough to gain a large number of people, and second, they don't have news that is local enough that the internet can't replace them. People have taken heart from recent circulation gains from the Washington Post and the New York Times. Yes, they've received a Trump bump, as it were, but most of the industry is very challenged. And beyond that, the internet has changed how people consume news and, to a good extent, delegitimatize the traditional gatekeepers or bundlers. What we know about the internet, of course, is that it removes the gatekeepers between the producers and consumers, and it unbundles things so that people only have to pay what they want. Today, if you read the Washington Post, if you're a millennial, you're probably reading it via Facebook. You're not reading the entire product. You're only reading individual stories. And those stories come through your news stream with lots of other stories from lots of other places. The Washington Post and all other newspapers have gone from having a readership, as it were, which read the entire product, first in print and later on the web, to a viewership, which reads occasional articles but doesn't have a grasp of the entire product. And that has also made the publications less powerful. So into this vacuum, as it were, has come fake news, because traditional news that it informs people is having real troubles. It's struggling. And fake news, and those who want to pollute the information ecosystem, have found an opening because the traditional legacy media is declining. There have been, of course, products that have been born digital, Vice, Vox, Axios, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But those publications, which are very impressive in their own right, do not in scale go anywhere near replacing the carnage that is going through legacy media right now in terms of local news, metropolitan news, investigative journalism, and the like. So there's been a real vacuum in news that fake news has replaced. And finally, technology, of course, plays a huge role in all of this, not in allowing distribution of news at scale to be very fast, irrespective of who produces it, but also in terms of easing entry. And finally, what we've seen so far is probably only the tip of the iceberg. Many of you have seen the fake Obama video, right? Where scientists were able to generate a video of President Obama lip syncing, as it were, to a different video. That's only the start of what we've already seen in photos. People don't trust many photos anymore. Soon they're not going to trust many videos anymore. And the ability to manipulate information for people's purposes will only increase. We'll also see, I think, more and more fake news targeted at companies as part of commercial strategies, short selling and the like. You don't have to delegitimize a product very long on social media to take advantage of a sharp decline, however temporary, in stock prices. And of course, we've seen, pioneered by Mr. Putin, information becoming an important part of political military strategies of countries. And we'll see that more and more often. Now, many have said, and I'm speaking quickly in order to stay on schedule, well, platforms, Facebook, Google, others, they created this, they have responsibility for it. And of course, the platforms do have a role, and I think they've moved a fair bit in recent years, in recent months, in fact. Mark Zuckerberg, right after the election, expressed considerable skepticism about fake news and its impact on the election. That's not his position today. And I think you're seeing Google, Facebook, Twitter, all taking steps. And I think there is a bigger role that they can play. But the idea that they are going to solve the problem by themselves, I think, is false. For one thing, the tools aren't there yet. Mark Zuckerberg in his manifesto earlier this year put a lot of emphasis on AI combating fake news. I don't think, a lot of people don't think it's going to be there anytime soon. The platforms have also expressed considerable interest in fact-checking. I don't think it scales to the problem in any real way. So there are technological limits to what the platforms can do, even in the short term. And of course, the pruning of information, keeping people from reading certain things, while the platforms have expressed a real interest in it, also goes against the DNA of these companies, which are to connect and to share information as widely as possible. And they're dealing, we see it played out in the newspapers and television every single day, with this problem of wanting to connect more, transmit more, circulate more, and at the same time being pressured to censor somehow. And that's a very complex problem, partially built into their DNA, partially built into their business models, that they're going to have to address, and it won't be an easy solution. That's why I believe at the end of the day, the solution to fake news is a market solution where people demand better quality news and say they're not interested in viewing or buying fake news. And if there is not demand, then supply inevitably will be reduced. This is going to require the education of the American consumer and eventually all news consumers to become much more intentional in what they see on the web. And it's going to be difficult and take a long period of time. Clearly, the technologies have gone way ahead of how we understand what we read. If I hear one more time, for instance, about how young people are digital natives and have such an innate understanding of the web, I really will go crazy, because if you've taught, you know it's not true. Yes, they are excellent at the tactile manipulation of these devices, but in terms of understanding, for instance, why does a Google search produce the particular results it does in a particular order? Can you differentiate between advertising and non-advertised content on the web? Then young people, frankly, are clueless. They're able to see a lot of things, but they're not able to differentiate, and they may have a positive bias against authority. Not parental authority, but authority in terms that there are actually people who know things about a particular subject, and they should be given more credence. When your news is coming at you on a Facebook feed where it all looks very flat and all looks very similar, that's very hard. And we've grown up with a generation that does not believe that there's a Walter Cronkite or a gatekeeper out there that can tell them what is credible news. In fact, they rebel against it. So the people who we see or we think are most credible in terms of using the information systems are not. And at the same time, of course, the vast majority of users are adults, and at least when we have kids, we have the school system to try to educate them. With adults, educating about news literacy is that much more difficult. I do take heart because I think over the long term, and this problem will not be solved quickly, that there is evidence that the American consumer can change preferences even if the eventual product is more expensive. We saw that in car safety, for instance, and we're seeing it now, quite obviously, in food. The biggest nutritional change in the American consumer's diet, and I say this looking over there at all the Coca-Cola, has been the decline of soda consumption over the last 10 years, especially diet soda consumption, which has gone down about 25%, despite the fact that the companies who manufacture these products, especially Pepsi and Coke, are the world's best marketers. Okay, they have been unable to stem the decline of their mainstream products because it has gotten through to the American consumer that this stuff is bad for you. And lo and behold, the companies, after banging their head for a while trying to advertise more, are diversifying into products which people actually say they want to buy, even if it is more expensive. Is it the end of the day? No. Is soda still being consumed? Yes. Is the American diet still poor? Yes. But we have seen that there can be changes if there are sustained programs of education. The analogy is not perfect because, of course, the government played a significant role in educating Americans about nutrition. It can't play that role in news because fake news, to remind you, is protected under the First Amendment. Okay? And we can't have a government saying you should read this and you shouldn't read that. It's not going to happen in this country. It might happen in other countries with a different understanding of freedom of the press. But there are other ways of educating the American consumer, and certainly my institution, we are devoting a lot of resources to reaching out to young people now and eventually to adults on how to become intentional news consumers. And the message is that in a previous generation, you could be on receive. If you listened to Walter Cronkite and read the New York Times, you were probably a well-informed American, and most of the news you consumed was credible. Those days are gone, never to return, and there's a lot to celebrate about those days being gone because 5 guys, mostly white, mostly in New York, are no longer controlling the news stream. We've entered into a much more difficult, more challenging, more exciting environment where consumers are going to have to be much more active. I conclude most of these talks when I speak to young people by saying, what I want you to take out of this is, you should have an intentional news strategy. What's your intentional news consumption strategy? Frankly, I don't care what it is. What's most important is you're thinking about it. And if we can get that message to as many Americans and eventually as many people across the world as possible, I think that would be a positive development. Again, we're in a revolution. I think an overwhelmingly positive revolution of expression. Inevitably, in any revolution, there are some very serious problems, and we're going to have to address the fake news issue for some time to come. Many thanks, and I look forward to the conversation with David and questions from you.
Right, can you all hear me? Good. So Jeff, thanks for that. That was really, really interesting, and I think touches on a lot of the really big issues here. One question I have is you got a little bit at this with the question of how do you educate people. But the message is very clear. I don't drink soda because it's going to kill me. But it's not quite so clear with news, right? Beyond just the simple question of fake hoax news, you have websites that deliver news in a way that makes people feel really good or angry, and they like that. So how does a Google or a Facebook send that message that, no, you should be looking at a more traditional outlet, or an outlet with kind of a more down the middle stance, which seems to be your objective?
Well, it doesn't have to be down the middle. It just has to be true. And there are certainly people with strong political perspectives that can make arguments. Do you hear me? Yes, okay. There's certainly people who make strong political arguments that are not in the political center. That's fine. And it's up to publishers, in part, to figure out how to market their news, their credible news, in as attractive strategy as possible. But you're right. You're going to die, or your kid is going to die in a car accident if you don't wear seat belts. Those were profound and important messages. But at the same time, we have to remember they each met considerable resistance when they were first developed. I think the issue is hard here, but as I think people get used to the idea that the digital life is such an important part of their overall life, they will be more accepting of the message. You have to think about how healthy that digital life is. The previous panel was really, really interesting, but part of the takeaway was 90% of Americans already have really good access to broadband. And that's only going to continue, and people are going to base more and more of their lives on their digital properties, their digital selves. To make an argument that you want to be digitally healthy is going to take some time, but I think it's possible.
In terms of who should make this argument, I think you got at sort of the different institutions, but what should the balance be between civil society or nonprofits like yours and platforms and the publishers? Because the publishers, frankly, don't have a lot of money to do this.
Well, I think everyone has to go full steam ahead and charge into this. We're at day one of this. We haven't even seen how the news industry is going to finally settle out. So I think everyone has to charge ahead and think about their own role. The publishers, of course, have a problem. It's them, in part, that is in the crosshairs, but they don't have a lot of funds right now. I think they have to work extraordinarily hard to think about what their products are in the digital world that are most attractive. And I think that everyone else has to do the maximum possible.
Do you think that there's a role, I don't want to harp on this too much, but a role, and we're sort of seeing this, for the platforms to help those smaller news organizations adjust, right? I mean, if you were talking to the metropolitan dailies, it is a lot harder for a Denver Post to have the sort of digital quality that the New York Times has, simply because of resources and because of the availability of probably also programming talent.
So I followed, as a lot of you have, Facebook efforts recently to help news publishers, as well as the news publishers' own initiative to try to get some relief from antitrust regulations, to join together to negotiate with the platforms. My bet is, in the long term, these are pretty marginal efforts, because the real problem with the Denver Post is that it's not a product for the digital era. And it's still trying to shoehorn a product from a different era into digital form. And that, if Facebook, Google wants to help news publishers, that's great. But the real problem is what they're publishing. And I think we have to have a lot more focus on saying, well, what are the news products of the 21st century going to be, rather than just helping, the people who were successful in the 20th century transition, because the evidence is that they're not going to in the main transition, and we may waste a lot of resources wishing for something that's not going to happen.
Yeah, so how would you say that outlets like that should go about doing that, if, again, they have sort of a limited runway?
It's not clear, but I think we have to think all over again about the nature of the product, about nature of stories, how people communicate with each other, and about some traditional newspaper and other products. For instance, if your scenario is there's going to be a flight to curation because people are just sick of all this stuff that's out there, which may or may not be true, and they'll flee to credible outlets. Okay, it's a story. It may not be true, but it's a story. So if that's true, why, if you're a newspaper, for instance, would you continue to have editorials? Because editorials, no matter what you say about the barrier between the publisher and the editors and the people reporting news go against the idea, at least somewhat, that you're a high-quality, nonpartisan producer? And I think that's the kind of question that's going to have to be asked. It's being asked, and there's a lot of innovation, but at the end of the day, I think the news is going to be saved by a lot more products that are born digitally.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the antitrust exemption, and for those of you who haven't been following this, a group called the News Media Alliance, which represents a lot of legacy news organizations, some small, but also the New York Times Company and News Corp, is basically starting a campaign to ask Congress to exempt it from antitrust laws so it can bargain collectively with basically Facebook and Google, who, as Jeff mentioned, controls basically the breadth of the digital ad market. You expressed some skepticism, but can you expand a little bit on what's your take on that approach?
Well, I have good friends at the News Media Alliance, and of course the work they do is very important. And of course there was some irony in some publications which on the editorial page rail for ever greater antitrust enforcement, but except for themselves, as it were. I won't name which properties those are. First of all, I don't think it's going to happen in the current environment. And it was bad luck for the News Media Alliance that the Democrats then just came out a few weeks later with their platform, which was, if featured anything, a skepticism of concentration in all its forms. But I think bigger picture is, to me, the proposed antitrust exemptions, which I don't think would get through Congress in any event, is all about, I think, saving a product of the 20th century. And I didn't see how it was going to help transition this industry into the 21st century.
Yeah, so I think the other side of this coin is sort of an increased skepticism of the size of the platforms. There are several new books in the works. I've talked to some of you. There's this Frank Foer book coming out. There's a Scott Galloway book called The Four. Jonathan Taplin wrote a book earlier this year, basically all arguing essentially Facebook and Google and Amazon and Apple are too big and something needs to give, or they're going to be able to use their market power in ways that have a huge influence over the way we talk about politics and our civic discourse. What's your take on that question of whether or not the platforms might be reaching sort of a too big to not look at the state?
I think it's going to happen. I mean, whether they qualify as monopolies in the traditional sense, because no one forces you to go on Facebook, after all, is a separate issue. But because of some of the issues that was mentioned in a panel yesterday about concentration and the like, I think it will happen. I think it's not only, people focus on the companies you mentioned, but it's also some of the companies that provide the backbone of the internet, that provide registration and the actual guts of it. Some of you may have seen, I think it was Cloudflare. Cloudflare. The owner woke up last week and decided that a particular neo-Nazi group shouldn't be on his service anymore. He controls about 10% of the traffic in the United States. And it was kind of shocking in its arbitrariness. Whether it was the right decision or not is something else, but as he freely admitted, it went against his own company's guidelines. I think where we are is, monopoly is one question, antitrust is one issue, but I think we're also going to have to focus on the particular place where we are, which is that public discourse is increasingly privately provided. That is, how we communicate with each other, how we communicate oftentimes with our elected leaders, is now being provided by companies, Facebook, Google, and the like. And while that is not without precedent in American society, it was, after all, television and newspapers that did it in the past. There were lots of newspapers, at least, and a few televisions. But it's the scale of who's providing the public discourse. And I think the companies we see are agonizing over this, and some of the flip-flops in the last week over hosting neo-Nazi sites indicate just how agonizing this issue is for the companies involved. It's not a First Amendment issue per se, the government is involved in it, but it's an issue that's vital to our public expression. And I think the companies and the public are going to have a much greater discussion of, well, if you are going to be this big or anywhere near this big, what's your role in providing private discussion? What are your guidelines, open and transparent, and are you going to stick to them? And what does it mean when you make a change? the antitrust issues are important. People will go through them, but I think there's this bigger issue at hand, which is private companies are companies, publicly owned, but they're private, are providing public discourse or the means of public discourse, and neither the public nor they have really come to grips with that yet. It's an extraordinary experiment in American democracy, which has happened very quickly and with very little discussion. And one of the things about Charlottesville showed, we're going to have to talk about this a lot more.
And what, I mean, you know, if this conversation happens, and I think it is starting to happen, it's going to be big and it's going to involve major corporate actors. But just like back in the napkin, what are some things that companies could do to grapple with this and maybe improve the way they address this responsibility?
I think they're going to have to make much clearer on the relationship between what hosting or providing access to means in terms of endorsement or non-endorsement. If they're on your site or on your service, are you endorsing them or not? I think the safer place is you're not endorsing them. You're not taking any position, but you're promoting free expression, and that your guideline should be in accord. If you don't like them, I think there are ways other than denying them service or denying them access that are useful. You don't like the neo-Nazis on your site, for instance? Well, maybe you should donate the profits from their hosting to someone rather than kick them off. That would show something and might also be an element of promoting free expression. And then finally, you know, one of the things we have in America is 200 years of jurisprudence around the First Amendment about what free expression, free speech actually means. Now, of course, it's